much. Good afternoon. My name is Kieran Schneemann, and I used to work for a long time in the pharmaceutical industry. I'm now an independent consultant working for the industry. This afternoon we have two very talented, very competent, very successful performers in the government affairs, corporate affairs space. They're the best in the industry, and it's my privilege to be invited to interview them, and I'm going to ask them to briefly introduce themselves to you. Penny.
Hi everyone, nice to see you this afternoon. My name's Penny George. I'm the Director of Corporate Affairs at AstraZeneca. It is a privilege to be on a panel with Kieran because Kieran actually was the person that really promoted me and asked me to join AstraZeneca after being a decade at Sanofi. And before that, I was a decade in politics, in government affairs and political campaigning.
Andrew.
Thank you, Kieran. Hi, everyone. Great to be amongst some old friends reconnecting. I was going to say something similar, actually, Kieran. It's a bit interesting us being asked the questions by His Majesty of Government Affairs, who has unbound success over many years. But I am the Director of Policy Public Affairs at Pfizer. I cover Australia, New Zealand and Korea, so good to be here today.
Thank you. Natalie McNeil, Vice President and General Manager of AbbVie this morning, in the opening session, the make or break moment for the pharmaceutical industry, made the point how disruptive the environment is, and she went on to say times are changing. It's a very uncertain environment, it's challenging, and as Natalie also reminded us, there are geopolitical forces beyond our shores that are challenging our environment here. Against that background and adding to this complexity, we have a government who had a historic victory once in a lifetime, in a second term victory. They're very comfortable with their win. Many are suggesting that they will still be in government by 2031, if not beyond. In addition, we have Mark Butler, who spent much of his time during the election campaign in April, May, shoulder to shoulder with his Prime Minister, Anthony Albanese. They were photographed so many times during the campaign. It was really interesting to note. And in many respects, it suggested that Mark Butler has been rewarded by not only being one of the most successful and powerful ministers in this government, but also having the largest health department or health portfolio in history, as well as the largest budget. Against that background, I'm going to ask Penny the first question. So Penny, and I just want to remind you all that the heading of this session is Where Government Affairs is Going, the Future of Pharma Policy and Access in Australia. Quite a different subject from many of the sessions we've had so far. So Penny, would you agree that in Australia, the centre of gravity in health policy and its influence is shifting? Some media outlets are suggesting that whilst the minister and his staff and the department may still have the last say, that the influences are moving away from the minister and those that he works immediately with, to media, to patient groups, to an individual person without any background or infrastructure can get a story viral that can change government policy overnight. What's your view on this? What's the implications for the pharmaceutical industry, if indeed this is a correct perception? And where is the minister's influence, and how are these other elements exerting influence on that final decision maker in the context of the pharmaceutical industry?
It's a really critical question, which I think we can look at it from two angles. Firstly, the importance of the government and the minister in the healthcare sector. Because when we look at universal access and the ability for as many Australians as possible to have access to our science, universal access is delivered by government reimbursing medicines and making universal access to doctors through Medicare. So I think we've got to acknowledge that the minister and the government, which is through the cabinet and then members of parliament, is absolutely critical to the healthcare sector. But then it's the second question about who is then the influence on that, which is absolutely shifting. And I think the more and more we work in government affairs, the more and more broader stakeholder engagement becomes important. And that's where, in particular, it's really interesting in the HTA review, which I understand has been a topic of discussion throughout the course of the day, is we need to really focus on the aspects about stakeholder engagement and, in particular, the importance of patient voice to government in the assessment of the value of medicines and the value of access to healthcare, because there are significant recommendations in relation to the way that the system can be improved so patients can provide better information for the government to assess the value of innovation, but also for greater understanding for patient groups to understand that government decision-making process. So I would say, firstly acknowledging, I think the government is the biggest stakeholder when it comes to getting access to medicines for Australians. But secondly, the government sees the importance of patient voice and also the clinical community in terms of informing access to medicines and the value.
Thank you. Penny, you're absolutely right there. And I am going to come to an issue of the relationship with government and trust. But before I do so, Andrew, the pharmaceutical industry, as we know, arguably works much more closely with government than in many other sectors and many other markets. In the field of government affairs and corporate affairs, government is often referred to as the number one customer. And I'm interested in that context with Mark Butler, who, as I mentioned earlier, is such a preeminent, powerful minister. But interestingly, in this second term of government, Mark Butler has less ministers, and given the size of his portfolio with the NDIS and ageing and health, he would normally have 2 additional cabinet ministers. That's 3 cabinet ministers, which existed in the last term of Labor, just before this one. So I'm really interested in your perspective. Do you think that health is underrepresented in cabinet at a time, only having one voice, when it arguably should be one of the loudest voices, given the community interest, given the interest during the election around health after the economy and housing?
That is a lot to unpack, Kieran. I might start on an observation. I think you're absolutely right in that this industry probably has the most touch points with government compared to any other industry. When you think about bench to bedside, government, they're regulating the clinical trial process through the TGA. They register our medicines, they set our intellectual property, and as you rightly said, Kieran, they're our biggest customer through the PBS, with 80% of scripts going through community pharmacy, and then you've got other various programs like NIP, NBA, and what have you. When you get to cabinet, I think it's a good point. I might make a couple of observations with Mark Butler, and you touched on the election campaign and the minister being the Prime Minister's right-hand man throughout that, and he was very effective throughout that, which showed in the election result. He does have 4 junior ministers underneath him, not in cabinet. You've got Jenny McAllister, NDIS, Sam Ray. With aged care, you have Rebecca White and also Emma McBride, plus you have Dan Repiccioli as a special envoy. So they're supporting him, but outside cabinet. So what voice does he bring to represent all of that within the cabinet? I think one other interesting observation is that there are 4 previous cabinet ministers, or I should say 4 cabinet ministers with previous health portfolio experience within that. So you have Chris Bowen, Tanya Plibersek, you have Katie Gallagher from her time in the ACT government as well, and also Catherine King. So whether that assists the minister, order tracks, they might know where all the bodies are buried, so to speak. But I think that is also an interesting dynamic to consider.
That's very true. And probably Anika Wells on top of that.
Indeed.
Yep. Good point.
Very good point. I should invite you to be a manalist, I think it was called from the last session, Kieran. But, the portfolio is massive, $220 billion. Think about that, that's 22 times the cost of the PBS top-line spend. It's huge. So just grappling with new challenges, NDIS coming into the portfolio that's growing at, double-digit growth. With the previous minister, it was at about 14%. It's forecast to be at 2.1% of GDP by 2030, so that's greater than defence spending. So a lot of his focus will not be in our sector. It'll be on some of the other key portfolio areas. NDIS, aged care reform is another big factor, which will be taking up a lot of his time, which he has to represent through cabinet as well. So getting his attention will become more difficult. I would go back to some of Richard's comments as well in the previous session. I think long-term trusted relationships are critical that we've managed to build up over many years, particularly when in opposition. It's a great time to build key relationships with government because you never know where they're going to end up. So.
Thank you. And Penny, this is really a question without notice and not a very fair one. But earlier today, there was an Ausdocc survey that was announced, and the session was called The Uncomfortable Truth. And 49% of 1,000 doctors that were included in that survey elected to suggest that they did not trust the pharmaceutical industry. I'm not suggesting that you could comment on that, but I'm interested in your and Andrew's perspective of the level of trust that's built up by the industry and by you both, who are really quite terrific practitioners in this space. Is there that trust with that number one customer, the government? What's your perspective or your experience in that regard? And I'm sorry, that is, an unfair question, but it's just one that's, I think we're all thinking about this trust element, how important it is.
Trust is a really important question for every stakeholder, whether or not that be doctors or patients. And in our world, for my world in corporate affairs, it's patients and it is also government. And I think that's absolutely the focus of government affairs. The way that we build relationships is focused on trust. We know that the saying is you can't fatten the pig on market day. In other words, you can't just turn up when you have a crisis. And that's why we have year in, year out relationships with members of parliament when they start on the backbench, when they may have absolutely no portfolio, no committee that they sit on which might be relevant to health. They might just be a marginal seat backbencher, and then they work their way through the ranks right up until being minister. And that's the way that we absolutely, year in, year out, focus on the need for relationships. That's also then how we build the reputation for ourselves as individual practitioners, that we are trusted as individuals, that the information that we are sharing with members of parliament or the perspectives that we are giving to them is built with a broad range of considerations, but fact-based and absolutely critical, which is why many times when I go and see a member of parliament, particularly it might be about a medicine or something, I will absolutely bring the medical team with me, because the importance of absolutely using a medical briefing to provide that information is really critical. And once you've got that magic formula, you've got a good relationship, you have good reputation, that's when we build reform. And that's where we build also broader access to medicines. And that's the focus really for government affairs and corporate affairs functions, which is why it is important to look at, I guess, across the board and what all stakeholders think in that.
Terrific answer. particularly without notice. And this is a good follow-on from that. So there may be some in the room, and I hope you won't be offended if I suggest there are some in the room that think that a meeting with the minister is the epitome. It's the absolute achievement. I mean, you've done it, you've succeeded. That's what success looks like. And that's what government affairs is there for. I'm suggesting that we've moved on from that, and that may be Andrew and Penny may say otherwise. But I'm really interested in your perspective. If we have moved on from that, what does good government affairs look like? What does success look like? You know, we're in a digital environment. Someone, as I said earlier, can get a story that goes viral, that can change the minister's perspective, or indeed the Prime Minister's perspective overnight. So where are we at, and what are your challenges, and how are you doing what's becoming a more and more difficult job? And thank God I don't work in the industry anymore.
You going first?
Yeah, happy to go first. And I think to your point, getting that meeting with the minister, as I'm sure many of us in this room, we've had visitors from our global colleagues coming over, and often that is one of the key KPIs. Can you get that meeting with the minister? So I think part of it is the way we convey the importance of how we go about government affairs, and it is very much a long-term play. It's about building trust, as Penny alluded to in the previous question. And I think you can probably draw on a very recent meeting that happened in the US yesterday, which was very successful by all reports in the media. But the meeting wasn't the cause of that success. It was everything that went behind that, the preparation, the years of relationship building on the ground that led to a lot of that success. So I think that's one part. The other part around what we could do better within the public narrative. I was actually having a chat with Megan on the way into this session today, and I think it is something that we can do. Traditionally, we have been quite a conservative industry about telling our story. We're good with data and facts and that sort of thing, but I think we need to be a lot more emotive, develop narratives. We're not retail, such as the Guild, for example, so we really need to do more in terms of being able to be more proactive, telling our story to the public about the amazing innovation that we do bring to patients.
I could certainly add to what Andrew has said, and it is universal. Get the meeting with the minister, which is absolutely a focus. What's the best outcome that you want to get from the meeting with the minister? Obviously, for them to understand your perspectives and to make the change that you need or to intervene. That doesn't always happen. And so I always look at it in terms of if you have had the opportunity to meet with the minister, then the minister can make the most informed decision. And we then need to respect the decisions of the minister and then go into a whole other campaign for another year or 2 years until the change happens, often. Which is really the other critical point. I can remember when I first started in the sector, which would have been 13 years ago, going out on the road with a sales rep. And he was so knowledgeable. And he got so excited that a doctor had actually moved a patient that he'd been speaking to for years and years and years along the treatment algorithm, which they had shared in this meeting. I remember getting in the car with him and him saying, this is the thing as a sales rep. I'm not a caterer, I'm not a courier, and I'm not a receptionist. I'm not just here to take the information that's created by the marketing team and just give it to the doctors. I'm actually here because I'm a knowledge expert. And that's the way, when he said that to me, I thought, I've remembered all those years later, because that's the role of government affairs and corporate affairs. We're not just there to make the meeting with the minister, it's all of that background work that we have to do, understanding all the intricacies. We're not just there to organise, if you get lucky enough to go and have lunch with an advisor, just to pay for the bill. We absolutely are intricately involved in our businesses across all the various functions, understanding the business priorities, and then our ability to transfer that into a meeting with a minister So again, when you have that meeting with the minister is the most informed they can be about the decisions or the issues that you're bringing to them. And that's the critical nature of government affairs.
Superbly answered. Thank you. Andrew just mentioned that just a day ago, our Prime Minister, met with President Trump in the White House and the Oval Office, and this session would not be complete if I didn't raise this. And can you believe it? Here we have the two senior representatives of government and corporate affairs of the two companies at the global level who signed the first deals with the President of the United States of America. So, Andrew, what does this mean? What's this look like? What's this all about? What is FMN? What's the tariffs? What's going to happen? What's going to happen in Australia? Just a very short, easy question.
Just an easy one. I'm actually going to flip the script on you, Kieran.
You can't do that.
I am going to ask you this question because you may be able to speak a little bit more freely than I on this subject. So, Kieran, what is all this MFN tariff stuff? What does it all mean? Do you think it's going to get real reform? Are we going to be able to leverage MFN at all with some of our local reforms here? What's your view on this US geopolitical situation, Kieran?
Andrew, normally I would, really make an example of you at this point, but Andrew...
Happened many times before.
Andrew, just a few minutes before the session started, warned me that this might happen, so I wrote a page of something that I could say, and because it is a very difficult topic, and I can understand that any senior executive of any company would have a real challenge knowing how to answer that, second-guessing the President of the United States, being questioned by their own global team. So, it is an issue. But it's also an issue because, frankly, the media and the community, and may I suggest many of you don't really understand, and how could you possibly understand what Trump is about, what he's doing with tariffs? Does the pharmaceutical industry support the imposition of tariffs? And I suggest to you that they don't, but that's certainly what's been reported in the media. President Trump is using the tariffs to encourage more manufacturing and more skilled jobs in the manufacturing sector into the United States. What is he using the most favoured nation policy to bring down the prices in the United States, using tariffs as a bit of a leverage. He's also offered a situation where the community in the US can use Trump RX to get their medications direct, not through that middle person, used to be called middlemen, who often take a very significant clip and have driven or be partly responsible for driving the price of medicines in the US. So that is some of the blunt tools that the American administration is using. Then on top of that, you've got the situation around innovation, recognizing the value of innovation, and Trump and the US president and the US administration have been saying for some time now that it's only fair and reasonable that each country, as in the case of defense, which President Trump has made, we should be paying our fair share, and we should also be paying our fair share with regard to the cost of research and development. And we should be paying a more equitable price for medicines in this country rather than leaving it to countries like the US to take a larger share. How am I going? Is this reasonable?
You're doing superbly well, Kieran.
Yeah. Yes. Have you got any? Because I'm looking at the time. Have you got any comment on that you could add before I ask the last question, which I think is quite an interesting one? Any comment on my answer to your question?
You've done a great job, Kieran. I think we're obviously, and we can probably running out of time now, but it does lead into a lot of reforms that have been going on for a number of years now locally. Not to connect the two, but I think there are some critical reforms both to accelerate patient access. Patients wait far too long to get their medicines here in Australia. And also, we really need to ensure that our global counterparts see Australia as an attractive place to launch medicines as well. So that's been going on in parallel. But yeah, happy to chat after the break as well.
Yep. Technician, could I ask you to put that last slide up if that's possible? That's terrific. Penny, if I could ask you just to comment on this. Penny was kind enough to provide this slide. But I'd also like to remind you that the next session after afternoon tea is who is the true customer of pharma? And the question is it HCP, healthcare professionals, or patients? Where is the government? Over to you and thank you.
Thanks, Kieran. The way that we often look at our strategy of engagement is in relation to the 4 R's and the 4 A's. So I was pleased to be able to share this with you. We look at it both in terms of the strategic approach we need to take on an issue, but also then drill that down to an individual stakeholder. So we're focusing on reputation in terms of the overarching aspect of AstraZeneca, and in our case. Then what's our relationships? What's the focus on reform? And what is the recognition of that issue? And then from the 4 A's perspective, if you don't have awareness of an issue, then you don't get access to talk about an issue. If you don't get access to talk about an issue, the Member of Parliament is not going to advocate on that issue. And if they're not going to advocate, then no action is going to take place. So that's why it's the magic 4 A's, 4 R's that we absolutely look to bring together that perfect storm of absolutely talking about the critical issues that are impacting patients and access to patients in Australia.
Penny, thank you very much. Audience, would you join me in thanking Andrew and Penny? Thank you.